So we're taking a little bit of a break for the holidays, but we want to bring you an episode from the first season that we loved that is near and dear to our heart. Why did you love this episode?
I like it when we talk with, the people who we invite on are often really smart, and that's a thing, right? But I love listening to Katie Watson. I think she's really brilliant. I think she answers a lot of the big questions that people have about abortion and debates about abortion in a really thoughtful way, and helps people think through some of the issues. Like, is it plausible that abortions are being performed after birth? It just is a fascinating interview.
Yeah, she's a smart person. I learned something new. Hopefully you will too. And maybe you can make a New Year's resolution, a New Year's ethical resolution. What's your ethical resolution for next year?
This is a great place for us to note that we did terribly on our ethics quiz. So I don't have one. Do you have one?
We'll learn more about ethics. How about that?
Okay, great. Yeah.
Right.
Bev, do you think of yourself as an ethical person?
Yes.
Like, you're a good person. You do good things.
I think so. I think I'm motivated by values rooted in goodness.
And that's important to you.
Yeah.
But, so I feel like we made a promise to listeners for this podcast that we were going to help them have tough conversations at the dinner table with people who maybe didn't get along with them or thought differently.
Yeah.
And it feels like one sort of underpinning of that is the ethical framework that would motivate this work.
Right.
Would you say that's fair?
That's fair.
Okay. And I don't know that we've given people the tools. We haven't given them the complete set of tools. And I think that the ethics behind it may help.
Yeah. We've given information, we've given examples, hopefully these stories have helped open people's minds and thinking about maybe how they would react or...
Yeah, I'm not saying we suck. I think it's good. What we're doing is good. But...
Are you an ethical person?
This is just another part of it. Yeah, no, I think I'm an ethical person.
Yeah.
But I don't think I have the language to express why I think I'm an ethical person.
Right.
I think Katie Watson does have that language.
Yeah.
I think she can help with that.
Yeah.
To understand why the work that we do is ethical.
I think one shift in my thinking about this care, I think because there's so much stigma for providers and for patients, like, you feel like you're kind of have to fly under the radar with the work that you're doing, but there are a lot of people that talk about conscientious provision of care, like providing this care from a moral place. And we, in some of our advocacy work, we've talked with a lot of legislators, and one legislator actually told us that, you shouldn't cede the moral high ground because the work that you're doing is very important and important for patients and their families, and the care that you provide is moral care.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't feel unethical when, right, I never have that feeling when I'm providing care.
Never.
Unless I'm having to deny someone the abortion that is because of the state, right?
Right, that feels unethical.
Now, I also think a lesson that we are failing to teach is how you convince someone who doesn't agree with you, and beating them over the head with ethical principles probably isn't any more effective than beating them over the head with anything else. But in case you end up in a street fight about the bioethics of abortion, we got your back.
I'm Katie Watson. I'm a professor at Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University in Chicago. I'm a bioethicist, and I have a secondary appointment in OBGYN.
So we want to tell you a little bit more about our guest, Professor Katie Watson. She's a professor at Northwestern in Chicago and is a lawyer, a bioethicist, and teaches law students, medical students, undergrad students about the bioethics of reproductive health care.
I don't know that people go into something thinking, oh, an ethicist is going to be a fun person to listen to. But I would say that ethicists are actually pretty fun to listen to and talk to.
Yeah. And just the way her brain works is pretty amazing. The day that I interviewed Katie, we had been at a meeting all day listening to talks. And if you go to scientific meetings, those meetings can be, physically and mentally exhausting. And so it was at the end of the day when I talked to her and she told me that she had oatmeal brain. And I was like, okay, yeah, I can kind of feel that. I sort of have oatmeal brain too. I've been sitting around listening to people talking. Yet Katie on oatmeal brain was just brilliant because she's brilliant. And we're excited to share some of the discussion that we had that day.
When I was in law school, I had a fellowship in reproductive freedom, a civil liberties fellowship. And 3 important things happened my third year of law school at NYU as a result of that fellowship. One is I took a bioethics and the law seminar from a very prominent lawyer who's a bioethicist. And I just loved it because I was in law school. I was all about con law, and my interests were bodies in the state and gay rights and abortion rights and the death penalty and sort of how the government can and can't control your body. Very interested in medicine. And then as a result of the fellowship, I did 2 internships, and one was at Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx in their ethics unit, which was run by a lawyer, which was very unusual at the time. There was really no role for lawyers in the field. In the second semester, I worked at the Center for Constitutional Rights, and as an intern, I worked on a brief for the Casey case, trying to establish that travel was an undue burden and waiting periods was an undue burden for poor women. And so that was when it first crystallized for me that this bioethics thing is really great, but there weren't really jobs in it, and I wanted to be a litigator. And so I went forward with my original plan, and I clerked in federal court, and I was an appellate public defender for death row inmates, and I then worked at Chicago's legal aid, representing people in the Southside housing projects doing general poverty law, but domestic violence. And then I just felt like torn because I didn't want to be someone who just wrote white papers that went into a circular file in Washington. And I just hadn't quite found the right changing policy, but still affecting lives on a day-to-day basis, and knowing that and feeling that. And it just started to dawn on me that as a lawyer, you can win all the lawsuits and pass all the laws, but if the nice people in the white coats behind the closed doors don't know your rights or don't care, that's really where power lies. And so I always thought I'd be a lawyer representing abortion providers. And it's really interesting that through this very long route of accumulating a really broad set of skills, being an ethicist who also understands the law turned out where my maximum contribution came from.
So for Katie, this course of study, which she's also written a book about, the Scarlet A, led her to consider the intricacies of ethics and reproductive health care and all of the gray areas that go with it.
For example, the topic we addressed last week, which when anti-abortion people describe abortion after birth, which we established really isn't a thing.
Well, that's just called murder, and that's illegal, and we don't do that. And I think... So in my book, I talk about honest abolitionists and trying to distinguish them from people who are just trying to pour some gas on a fire, And so I think some of the people who say abortion after birth, I actually don't believe that they believe that. Right. They're just trying to say something inflammatory versus someone who's genuinely believes that. And I think a lot of the people in the media and politicians who say it don't actually believe it. But then people hear it and they're like, well, someone I believe to be credible said it to me. And now I'm really worried. And so for me, I also have a background in improvisational theater. And so the yes and model is so ingrained in me, the affirm and add. I also am not a believer in fake common ground. There's so much of this, could we compromise? But I actually really care about children and babies. And I think lots of people do. And so being worried that babies are being murdered is just evolutionarily functional. That's very healthy. And I wouldn't criticize anyone for being worried that babies are being murdered. Like, I'm against that too. You can partner on that, right? And the next step is, can you imagine a woman asking for that? Like, I've delivered a baby. Could you kill it? And now step 2, can you imagine a doctor saying, sure thing? Like, tell me more about who you picture. A, asking for it. B, saying okay, and that they happen to be in the same room. What an amazing confluence, right? And so I think this goes to the demonization of abortion providers, that they must not respect human life. And so we've got to work our way backward. And a baby right after it's born becomes praxis, maybe for a 3rd trimester abortion. Is that really what you're talking about? You're uncomfortable with like post-viability abortions? Because we could talk about that. So I'm just very into like, can we talk about what you're really upset about before I engage with you? My post-Dobbs analysis always was that they just said that women aren't people under the Constitution. If the growing embryo that lives inside of me has rights superior to mine, and it's not a constitutional person, then I definitely am not. And Dobbs didn't grant embryonic personhood. It allowed states to make that decision, which again, you're allowing my state to decide my body must be used in servitude for the benefit of another person. And if you look on the lay-on of the slave states with the abortion ban states, it's very uncomfortable how neatly that fits. I mean, obviously some of the states weren't states then, but so this idea of subjugating one person for the benefit of another is one we have historical precedents for, and that one didn't go well.
Generally, the doctors who perform in vitro fertilization are a subspecialty of OBGYN called reproductive endocrinology and infertility. And the process of in vitro fertilization is they take sperm, join that sperm with an egg in a test tube-like environment.
Right, in an artificial way.
Yeah, and that forms an embryo.
Right. And if you think about the causes of infertility, the causes are either a male factor, so not enough sperm, a female factor, or, problems with ovulation, problems with egg quality. And so by using science to overcome those issues, they're able to form an embryo that then can be returned to either the patient's uterus or a surrogate's uterus. In the U.S., there are many states where that's allowed. And that is how that pregnancy gets started.
And then there are interesting arguments about embryos frozen outside of uteruses. So the opponents of abortion, there's 2 primary arguments from the ethics space against abortion. And one is the substantial identity argument, that a fertilized egg is substantially the same as you and me because it has that DNA blueprint. The second one is potentiality theory, to say like, great, we know an acorn isn't the same as an oak tree, but it could be, and it's going to be undisturbed. And so it should be treated based on the fact it can become an oak tree. It's that we're not saying that a one-celled organism is the same as you and me or substantially the same, but it has potential to be, and that's why it gets this high moral status. It really blows the potentiality argument out of the water, IVF, because actually a fertilized egg or a 5-cell blastocyst or whatever, it doesn't have everything it needs to become a person.
Right.
It doesn't have a human woman for at least 23 weeks or whatever, 24 weeks. It doesn't have everything it needs. Right. That DNA blueprint is necessary, but not at all sufficient. So it's fascinating to me when you freeze an embryo, how it suddenly becomes very apparent that it doesn't have everything it needs to become a person, a born person. And the idea that that is a life form you need to protect less. I think there are ethical arguments why that could be true, that you don't necessarily have to treat abortion the same as IVF, but it still goes to that person with uterus as hostage.
Yeah.
Like somehow you allow that hostage taking, but if it hasn't yet found a willing host, then, I mean, it's so, it just puts my mind in pretzels in a way. And then there's the whole column of pronatalist arguments of but it's not just that both policies are consistent with making people have babies, it's who's having babies. So IVF is coded white and middle class, so it gets a pass.
In general, IVF doesn't feel as controversial as abortion care. But in fact, we've seen that it has become controversial in states like Alabama, where they briefly banned in vitro fertilization.
Right. And it created a tremendous amount of chaos for people living in Alabama or who had embryos that were stored in Alabama, because I think as an outsider sort of watching this whole thing play out, all of a sudden patients who had their reproductive health care impacted by abortion bans were standing there saying, well, this shouldn't impact me because I'm different, because I want to be a parent. So these rules shouldn't apply to me.
Right. But in general, when people have IVF, they have multiple embryos that are a product of the process. So, they remove multiple eggs and they fertilize each of those eggs, and then several embryos come out of it, and then people will freeze those embryos in case they want to get pregnant in the future. And so they'll do a transfer of some of the embryos to try to lead to implantation and a pregnancy, and then leave some frozen. And the concern in Alabama was that if you destroyed those embryos that were in the freezer, that was the same as performing an abortion, and by Alabama law, essentially killing someone. And so these embryos that were in the freezer were frozen people.
Right. According to the law. And so, what's really interesting is that there's this romanticization of what an embryo or what a blastocyst will go on to be, when in fact in natural cycles where people have an egg that's fertilized by a sperm, many of those blastocysts do not implant into the uterus and do not go on to become a pregnancy.
Half.
Right.
More than half. Something like that.
And then, 20% of identifiable pregnancies go on to end in miscarriage. And so it's not a perfectly efficient process in the first place. So if someone has a blastocyst that doesn't implant in their uterus, have they done something wrong? Are we going to start, legislating or criminalizing people who can't get pregnant or who have miscarriages?
Or on the flip side, certainly not to minimize the struggles that people have with fertility and how upsetting that can be, but people feel differently about, having a cycle where they have a period versus having a miscarriage. And people feel differently about having a first trimester miscarriage in general versus having a second trimester miscarriage or a third trimester miscarriage or a third trimester loss, or even worse, having a child die, right? We ascribe different emotions to those different experiences.
Right. And it's different.
Yeah.
And it's different for every single person.
It's also fascinating to me that this particular medical procedure decides whether a person will be born or not. It is about one of the most fundamental topics we could talk about, which is procreation, and that women's power, and I use the word woman advisedly, but the power of people with uteruses to create another human being. It is amazing. And yet, instead of being lauded, applauded, and showered with a year off work, right, we are demonized and need to be controlled. And it's obviously very tied to sexuality and all those things. Yeah. So let's go back to Roe versus Wade in 1973. That my shorthand for my students that I say only half jokingly is people established a right to abortion. No, it didn't. It established a physician's right to perform an abortion and a woman's right to beg. And it situated all the power with the physician, both because Blackmun is trying to anchor it in a respected group, physicians, not those skanky women. And only in Casey is written in 1992, like an equal protection decision that centers women, except for the part where it sticks with privacy and doesn't switch to an equal protection rationale.
So Katie talks about undue burden, which was an element of the Supreme Court decision, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, back in the 90s, but was an important standard prior to the Dobbs decision. Can you define undue burden and sort of give some examples?
Right. So I think undue burden it's like this test that states can determine whether or not a law creates a significant enough obstacle for patients to make it hard for them to access abortion care. And so examples would be like in the Casey case, they determined that having spousal approval prior to a procedure was an undue burden that was placed on patients. I think other examples in my mind of what an undue burden is requiring patients to, complete 72-hour counseling, or, in some states they require this biased counseling be performed by the same provider as the person doing the procedure, which logistically is really almost impossible. And so in my mind, that's an undue burden on both the clinician and the patient. What are some other examples in your mind?
Well, in my mind, I think the financial component is frequently an undue burden, and that's because abortion is frequently not paid for by health insurance. And most importantly, I think in shaping care for our patients is that Medicaid doesn't cover abortion at the federal level. Then there's only 17 states that use state funding to cover abortion through Medicaid. And that's really important because 75% of people who have abortions would use Medicaid for other medical care. And so that means that at least 3/4 of patients go to the doctor thinking, I will have insurance coverage for this, and then they don't. And so they have to pay out of pocket. And that really is an undue burden. I mean, that's like
right.
My definition of an undue burden for sure.
Absolutely. And like if you're a person who is already living in poverty, struggling to make ends meet, you might be making a decision that could temporarily impact whether or not you could put food on the table. And so I definitely think that's an undue burden.
Yeah, I remember in the 2020 presidential election cycle, during one of the debates, Kamala Harris noted that almost half of Americans wouldn't have $400 for an emergency. They would face bankruptcy or need to borrow money if they had an unexpected $400 expense. And generally, abortion in a clinic with a procedure or with medication is $400, $500. So right there, that's your unexpected expense that puts people who already are struggling to make ends meet into poverty, or makes them borrow money, or means that they can't afford the care that they need.
Yeah.
But physicians who perform abortions got pulled into the tainted world of just women generally. And have you noticed the pinking of your field? So now you're all just women except with medical degrees. And so can we really trust you? You're just part of the witchy conspiracy to let ladies run things. And so we're not done fighting that fight, or a more hopeful way to say it is having that conversation of, are women people? Are we full adults? And can we use the medical technology that lets us function in the world equivalently to men, which is to have sex without having a baby afterwards if we don't want to control our fertility and time our childbearing so that we can have a job or go to graduate school or space our children or do whatever, so that being a mother doesn't have to be our only role, or perhaps a role at all for those who decline it. That's a radical reorienting of millennia of human existence. And so, I don't think the idea we haven't gotten it worked out in the last 49 years. My historian colleagues would chuckle, that's but we're right in it. And we've come so far so fast. And like, of course, this is the very predictable gumming up of those wheels that are moving along. And it doesn't mean they won't move, and it doesn't mean I accept it or I think it's okay or normal or but it just means like I'm not surprised. It's truly about women's personhood. And we talk so much about embryonic and fetal potential personhood, or when does personhood start? It's so rare to talk about women's personhood. And that is a cultural, historical, and legal and moral construct that is really very, very recent. Women's personhood, from everything from being able to open a credit card, to sign contracts in your own name, to hold a job. I mean, like, it's just so recent that, of course, controlling our fertility is part and parcel of that. We have taken steps backwards, but to me, the way I get out of bed in the morning, and this is just going to sound so stupid, but I think Dobbs is how you know you're winning. We had abortion rights, and they were very imperfect, and they weren't accessible to all for 49 years. But pair that with like everything from, the congressional legislation about equal pay and equal access to school and the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, and like, family medically, we're coming back after we have babies. You can't just fire me when I'm pregnant. You have to hold my job. I'm coming back. All the progress, which I see reflected in my 50% female medical school class that I teach, that when social control mechanisms can't be done kind of under the rug, they come out in law in these very ugly and brutal ways because they're not being effective as social norms. And so think of what is uglier and more brutal than to say we can seize women's bodies by law and force them to reproduce. Like, the disgust we have at that shows you the desperation on the other side, because you couldn't do it the pretend way. To say, make them do what you wanted them to do without a law. So I think of Dobbs as like, wow, they're desperate. They're really desperate. It makes me laugh when people are like, some people in the general bioethics world, I've heard this once or twice, saying like, oh, are you still working on abortion? And I was like, yeah, I didn't solve it. Like, what are you talking about? Like, they're confused. Yeah. And I even had one person say, this was not an elegant comment. They literally said, I got to say, when I first heard you wrote a book about abortion, I was like, what is she wasting her time on? I mean, that there's nothing to talk about there. But now that Dobbs has happened, I really want to say thank you for your work. And I was like, you could have just cut to part 2. Don't tell me, like, I've been walking around thinking you were an idiot. And then that happened.
I know.
But I just think, like, it's race, it's class, it's religion, it's women's studies, it's medicine, it's politics, it's law. Like, I am fascinated at every juncture.
Opinions expressed on this podcast are our own. Philanthropy is helping us highlight these stories, and we hope you'll continue supporting this work by subscribing and sharing the show and getting involved in your local community.
This podcast is executive produced by us, Dr. Bev Gray, Dr. Jonah Swartz, and Jane Marie. Production by Little Everywhere. Thanks to Nick Thorburn, Patrick Ford, and Maker for our score, and Jamal Walton for original artwork. Extra special thanks to everyone who lent their knowledge and their voices to the show this episode. Our next episode will be the last one of the season, and you'll go on a trip with us where we travel to another state where abortion laws are more reasonable for patients and where we travel to provide care and patients travel to receive care.